You're listening to A Slice of Therapy with me, Alun Parry. One thing that happens in my line of work is that occasionally a journalist will contact me and will be seeking some sort of quote for an article they're about to write. And it'll be some aspect of psychology or, mental well-being. And one of the things that I notice come up really commonly is that journalists seem particularly interested in getting a quote about people who hoard things. Hoarders, they're called. And you might have seen programs on TV even about these as well, where people are filling their homes with all sorts of stuff and find it really difficult to let it go again. And to such an extent that it really is getting in the way of their life and their living environment. And what the journalists want me to do is to answer a question. And that question is, why do they do what they do? And it always strikes me as an unusual question to ask in many ways because, well, first of all, they're asking me to comment on a group of people en masse. And I'm guessing that if I comment on any group of people en masse to try and describe why somebody does what they do, then it's not necessarily going to be accurate because, naturally people have different histories, different experiences, and that leads us to maybe a similar place, but perhaps we've come from a different journey. And so trying to answer a question like that is kind of riven with simplicity, I suppose, and we'll miss many of the people who are struggling in that way in terms of defining them by an answer to that question. But the answer that I'm tempted to come up with, although I tend not to come up with an answer at all because, I can't be sure whether people are going to be treated respectfully or whether it's going to be some sort of sensational piece. And so often something like that, I will step aside and not make a comment at all. But the comment that I'm most tempted to ask when they say, why do they do what they do? Is I'm tempted to ask, well, why do you do what you do? Because if you can find the answer to that, then you'll be really close, probably, to the answer to your initial question. Because we all have various ways, don't we, of managing our anxieties and our struggles, and they're different for each of us. So some people might hoard objects, some people might do retail therapy and shop more than they can afford. I, for instance, when I'm feeling low, I'm more tempted to eat chocolate. So we all have these kind of coping strategies for the anxieties of life. And so when people say, why do they do what they do? I think probably the most accurate answer is to say, well, why do you do what you do? And then you're going to be pretty close to the truth, because whatever it is that helps you manage your anxieties and struggles is going to be very similar to the reason why they do. And so if you're looking for a simple answer, look inside at the various ways that you do it, and you'll probably understand those particular people a lot better too. Now, the reason why I'm raising that is because there is a sense, isn't there, whereby when we're looking at psychology, there can be a tendency that we view people as irrational. And I don't know whether that's where these journalistic submissions and requests are coming from. But even in terms of certain types of therapies, I notice that they're premised on the idea that we're irrational. And so there'll be various therapies that talk about, I don't know, these are irrational thoughts. The way you're thinking here is irrational. The way you're behaving is irrational. And there's something about that which doesn't sit too easily with me. The idea that we're simply behaving irrationally. Though we're not making sense somehow. I mean, it kind of implies a sort of brokenness, doesn't it, with our thinking, and that we're irrational. And it's very common that, within the world of therapy, this is a view that is relatively widely held. I mean, I suppose things like CBT are based on the idea that we have irrational thoughts. And while I can accept that we can have thoughts that aren't particularly helpful, the idea that they don't make sense is something that I struggle with. Because I suppose I come to the issue of psychology and the struggles that people face by making a core assumption that actually it does make sense. Whenever I'm working with somebody, what tends to happen is that somebody will come in with something that they no longer want to do. So there'll be something that's getting in their way, for instance, a way of thinking, a pattern of behaviour, whatever it happens to be. It's typically, this is happening and I don't want this anymore. Now, we could look at it and say, well, it clearly doesn't make sense that this is happening because you don't want it and yet you're doing it, so therefore that mustn't make sense. And I take the opposite view. I think it makes perfect sense. And part of our job is to try and figure out how that makes sense. Let's suppose, for instance, that a person came from a background where, I don't know, every time they put themselves to the fore, they were ridiculed. And they may now in life be thinking, I wish I wasn't hiding. I wish I wasn't making myself invisible. That's the thing that I want to change, and I desperately do want to change. And yet, it makes sense, doesn't it? Why somebody with that history, with that training as a youngster, that every time they put themselves to the fore, they were ridiculed and criticised. Why they would have learned very, very young that it was a fairly dangerous thing to do. And so the safest thing to do, the most self-protective thing to do, is to be invisible. And then, of course, life changes. We're no longer young and we become adults with all those adult resources. And yet, that old training still remains. It's still our instinct to protect ourselves by staying invisible. It's just that it no longer serves us anymore because the situation has changed. But I think it's a real invalidation of that person to just assume that the fact that they're being invisible and hiding themselves and missing these opportunities that they would really love, I think it's an invalidation to assume that that's irrational. Because to me, it makes perfect sense when we look at that person's history and the kind of interpersonal rules of engagement that were going on when they were younger. And we all have these histories, and we all engage in various thinkings and behaviours and actions which kind of get in our way now. And so, of course, somebody could point and say, well, that's clearly irrational. But we all have good reason why we keep on doing that thing. We all have good reason in terms of where that come from. We all have some way in which this thing that we'd like to change, we keep reproducing it because it's protective. So just like that person who grew up in such a way that every time they put themselves out there, they were ridiculed, well, it makes sense to hide. And in the same way, whatever we do makes sense. And I think it's a nicer way of thinking about our emotional well-being, our mental well-being, our psychologies, that we're not irrational, but what we're doing makes sense. What we're doing was designed initially to protect us. And we may still be doing it because we haven't realized, for instance, that it would be safe to let that go. And so when you think of it in those ways, it's not a quest for rationality. It's not a quest for sanity. It's a quest for safety. Because if we're doing this thing that we no longer want to do because it feels so much safer for some reason that we have to figure out, then the quest is to make that safe enough to be able to no longer keep doing that in service of our own protection. Because we'll no longer need that anymore, and we'll realize we no longer need it anymore in order to protect us. We'll reach a point where we realize that we're actually safe without that behavior. And so it's a different way to frame this. It's a different way to think about it, which I think is much more validating to each person, to each of us. Not to think that we're irrational, but to think that what we do makes sense, and how we got to this point where we do this thing makes perfect sense. And so really, when I'm tempted to reply to the journalists who say, why do they do what they do? And I'm tempted to ask, well, why do you do what you do? I suppose if I was going to give a very simple answer, my simple answer would be because somehow, in a way that we need to figure out, it makes sense. And somehow it feels safer. It feels safer to be doing that than the alternative. And so if we were looking for a simplistic answer about anything really, then that might be the one that I would come up with. And so if you like this idea and you'd like to share that way of thinking about things, please share the episode. If you'd like to work with me direct, I'm Alun Parry, and you can find out more at liverpoolpsychotherapy.co.uk. And please do subscribe to the podcast. It's completely free and there's a new one every day. So thanks for listening, and I'll be back again tomorrow with another one.